Hello, and welcome to F1 Into the Barrier with me, George Close, reviewing the Miami Grand Prix. Ladies and gentlemen, Kimi Antonelli has just taken his third win in succession, and as all the pundits said a million times, it came from his first ever pole positions, another hat-trick. So, has the momentum of the championship changed? Yes, certainly it has, of course. And the perceptions around Kimi are really changing. And what does this mean for his championship battle with George? And we're going to unpick that over once again a very long weekend because it was a sprint. And I think the first thing to say is we'd had a big hiatus from Formula One. Mercedes hadn't been able to capitalize on their advantage whilst other teams were catching up. So they've missed out on 2 Grand Prix worth of probably quite a good handful of points. And instead, we've seen multiple teams bring serious amounts of upgrades. We're talking 20 upgrades for some teams. And Mercedes are only bringing them in next time out in Canada. So what we've got to see, which is very interesting, is by how much these other teams around them have closed the gap. And it seems by quite a lot. So if we look at the sprint, Mercedes got the energy deployment wrong in the sprint, and they clearly weren't as confident with car setup. And we ended up seeing a 1-2 from McLaren, which was pretty impressive. And actually, if you look at the Sunday and some of the strategy options, there's an argument to say McLaren seem to be, with their new upgraded car, on par with Mercedes, particularly of Kimi Antonelli, who was really, really quick around the track. Ferrari brought the most upgrades of any team, and they have also closed the gap, but I think what they'll be worried about is McLaren seem to have closed it more, and Red Bull seem to have found stability in the car to give Max confidence to drive it, because we saw a much, much more confident Max Verstappen behind the wheel of the Red Bull. Hadjar had a bit of a weekend to forget. We'll come on to that later. But we've definitely seen improvement amongst these teams that are trying to challenge Mercedes. And as I say, I think Mercedes are going to feel really hard done by these 2 cancelled races in the Middle East. The good news for them, their upgrades are coming in Canada next time out, so maybe they'll jump ahead. But there's never any guarantee that upgrades work the way you expect and the way they model them. I mean, they're so good at modeling them now. But who knows? Maybe the gap has closed and maybe it looks like McLaren are going to be able to put on the biggest charge. So, yes, in the sprint, we had notably the McLaren 1-2. Then Leclerc with, again, another really good performance, Verstappen. And then Antonelli got a 5-second time penalty for track limit. So he dropped a couple of places. That's why he's down low. And then Lewis, who, again, qualifying is letting him down at the moment. And you can see, even in the race, once those cars are set ahead of him, they don't feel Ferrari, they've got enough of a delta to really push forward. I mean, even when you look at Leclerc, you see the starts, Ferrari are able to make positions at the starts, and then really they're holding and fighting and falling away into the pack, maybe in and around Red Bull at the moment. But let's move on to some of the main themes, and we'll get to qualifying. So, bit of a bogey track for George Russell by his own admission. Bogey track's probably not a great concept to have as a driver, I would say, but I think you've got to be honest, he doesn't click with the circuit and never has. And Kimi Antonelli put in a worldy lap, really, really good, as did Max. And it was very interesting seeing the times increase throughout the sessions as those drivers got more and more confident. And yeah, it felt like a very exciting qualifying. You didn't entirely know who was going to pip it at the top. You could tell who was fast. Leclerc is faster than Lewis at the moment, still very clearly. And he is just a magician at qualifying. I can't believe continually how far ahead he manages to qualify. Norris had a good time. Piastri didn't have a great qualifying. Colapinto for the Alpine managed to get ahead. Gasly had done reasonably on the sprints, worth pointing out. So Alpine were there or thereabouts. And we then had Hadjar in 9th and Gasly in 10th. So an interesting setup for the race. And the race was very exciting. Again, I still think some of the maneuvers are a little artificial in that their energy boosts down a straight rather than passes into a corner. But let's get ahead and talk about the first corner. We had another sluggish-ish getaway from Antonelli, who can't seem to get his starts right, although he seems to feel that he's following the procedure correctly. So the smaller turbos of Ferrari is clearly getting the launch, and McLaren got better launches, as did Verstappen off the line. And they all trundle down to the first corner. And we see Max try to cover off Antonelli by pushing wide. And before he actually clips the apex or gets to the apex of the second corner, he's already losing the rear. And he does a 360 spin. Now, of course, Martin Brundle called it absolute genius because he caught the spin in the 360 and only lost 8 places. Listen, he's very good at catching spins He did spin. I mean, can we point out that he did spin? And if other drivers had spun, I think even if they caught it in the same way, they'd be getting a much more damning report from some of the pundits. So he spun and he dropped back to 8th. Lewis has to take avoiding action after his good start, so he ends up not getting the leap he wants, and Leclerc manages to nip through into the lead. And we then have this front three battle that took us through the race, right? We had initially the Leclerc, Antonelli and Norris show at the front. We had some interesting incidents behind. We had Colapinto going into Lewis, racing incident. I mean, first lap leniency, but was he? You've seen them given, is what I would say. You'd see maybe some penalties by the stewards there, but okay, fine. Lewis's pace at the moment, I'm not sure he would have made huge strides forward anyway, even when he was more comfortable with setup, but it really nullified his race, and the gap behind to the Alpines at the moment is such that they're not really able to challenge. You just have whatever the slowest of those front big four teams, take Hadjar out of the equation, of course, will be 7th. So we have a very weird incident that's not been picked up enough, which is the Liam Lawson Max Verstappen. They race very, very hard at the beginning. So the fact that they're racing hard obviously dispels some of the, oh, they're just a second team line, okay? They are a bit of a second team, though, which we'll come on to. So they have some close comings together, and Max goes off track with Liam Lawson, and Liam Lawson comes out ahead of the corner and keeps the place. Now, had that been put to the stewards, given some of the way that the first lap and first few lap incidents are adjudicated upon, it's conceivable they wouldn't have told Liam to let him pass there, but they were very quick at letting Max through. So Max manages to make a few places, but he's killed his tyres and he pits to 16th, and then we see him progressing through over that first stint and ultimately trying to catch up behind Lewis. But we end up in a bit of a stasis at the front. They're holding out. There's the rain maybe coming. There's the rain maybe not coming. We're hearing of showers. Ultimately, rain didn't really play a part, but you could clearly see where teams were trying to play it into strategy. And maybe it was one on strategy, because were McLaren mugged a little bit by Mercedes? I mean, it's very tricky. When you look into the other areas they got gained, Antonelli had 2.2 seconds pit stop, and his outlap, he gained 1.6 seconds. So there was a serious undercut, and there was a big delta when it came to pit stop time. And when he rejoins next to Norris, I mean, it is really close. I think the one thing to think of that, even if Norris had got ahead, would he have stayed ahead? The Mercedes still does seem to be the quick side. And Antonelli is very, very quick at the moment. He's getting flustered. I'm very impressed because he can lead. He's done 3 races now where he's gone pole to win. And that's a skill we've talked about a lot on the podcast. And that's a skill you need to be a champion. So he's got that skill. I think these sorts of regs suit him because of the energy deployment, the overtaking, where maybe he's not been as strong as last year. There is definitely more opportunities to get past the person in front of you than try and put out the time and break the second gap. I'm not sure it would have entirely gone Norris's way, but the one thing to say is Norris kept putting him under pressure for nearly the entire race, and those two really broke away. Ferrari tried to cover off a George Russell pit stop, and Leclerc was quite vocal on the radio, but again, I think he'd ultimately fallen away from those guys. But it really played into the race, and we saw Max then being able to still put in reasonable lap times on these very old tyres, and Piastri then manages to eke his way through. And that's what it was quite nice and interesting end to the race, because we had the Leclerc spin, which you can see very tactically, he actually lets Piastri pass. And you can see he doesn't open the active aero to let Piastri pass to try and then get him down the next straight with energy deployment. It's very interesting how drivers are thinking about this. But he loses it, has contact, and ultimately that contact, he's then holding on, and Piastri's already got past him, but we then have Verstappen able to get past him as well, and George gets past him as well. And ultimately, the 20-second time penalty he gets, which was given and very harsh because he'd cut all the corners, was them trying to recreate a drive-through penalty. So he ends up behind both Lewis and Colapinto. And I think he threw away quite a good weekend, particularly in comparison to his teammate. And that would have been giving him the real confidence boost. I think the worrying thing for Lewis is that it came down to a Leclerc mistake. We've seen Leclerc mistakes before in races. It's something that has cropped up here and again throughout his career, maybe why some of the form on the Sunday has been questioned. But I think worryingly for Lewis, Leclerc's got him at the moment, absolutely got him. And it's particularly in qualifying. And where the cars are, he can't seem to overcome that. He's relying on Ferrari bad strategy or these penalties or stuff to really be able to stay close to Leclerc at the moment. So I think it's worrying. We had Hadjar's, of course, the first safety car. That was really clumsy, wasn't it, by Hadjar? very visibly angry. It's almost performatively angry, but yeah, not very good. And Red Bull are impatient and won't have liked that at all. We had the Gasly Liam Lawson. So Liam Lawson actually had a gearbox problem. That's why he couldn't turn as much. And that was very scary. I mean, Pierre was okay. The halo obviously coming into good use there to protect the drivers. So that was nice to see, particularly when you think about the death of Alex Zanardi and what he went through, obviously outside of Formula One, but the safety in and around these drivers is really important. Where else could we talk? We had the Hulkenberg nose change that kind of killed his race for the Audis. We'll just quickly cover the other teams. So Audis, not very impressive weekend. Aston Martin, I mean, Alonso managed to finish ahead of an Audi, so maybe they've made some progress, but they looked utterly dismal again. They're so far off. Racing Bulls, again, nothing really to write home about other than Liam Lawson had the crash, let Max past, ultimately had to retire, Lindblad finishing 15th, and Haas losing out to Williams this time. Albon and Sainz, 9th and 10th. And what was interesting when you look in the top 10, I think 7 were Mercedes powertrains. So 2 are Ferrari, obviously, and you can definitely tell at the moment that Ferrari are a little bit behind in power. And then we have the Red Bull Ford engine. And they seem to have made some improvements. It's very impressive how new they are into Formula One. So some improvements there, but clearly helping the teams at the moment. Clearly a slight advantage to the teams that are with the Mercedes power unit. So an interesting theme. What other key themes have we got to talk about? Verstappen crossing the white line, I guess, was a key moment. Investigators after the race. I mean, frustrating in the race. I got very angry, but it wasn't clear from the onboard. And you would like these things to be resolved earlier. There's maybe questions, given that it was going to be a penalty if you did cross that line and they'd already had to widen it for the drivers over the course of the weekend. Why maybe there wasn't the live feed available to the stewards. But I think JB rightly pointed out, well, if the angles aren't there, it is quite hard to penalise when you don't know. You need the conclusive evidence, because it had been hugely, hugely important in the race. And ultimately, I don't think it made any difference. So we can forget about that one. Looking at McLaren, I think Piastri will have been happy coming home with second and third. Again, as I say, McLaren have definitely made advances and they feel like maybe a missed opportunity for Norris. He certainly felt so. But I'm not so sure. But I think Piastri will feel confident that McLaren once again have a car that's very good on its tyres, because he really managed to start seeing, yes, there's some tyre offsets, but at the end of the race, that paid dividends where he started making ground on the cars in front of him. Then the other important thing to talk about is Red Bull have brought in their Maxarena or Maxarena. I hate that, by the way. Very forced pronunciation. But the Maxarena wing, it's got a huge gap. The gap isn't as important as maybe it looks in Formula One. It's about the drag. So if you have a massive gap or a medium gap, as long as the drag reduction is the same, it's not hugely important. But definitely seemed to be the big upgrade as well to help Red Bull this weekend. So wonder if Mercedes will have it in Canada. Got to think the other teams are all going to be looking to do it. So will that be even more time for Mercedes? Another Max incident was, of course, the Albon one. And Albon, I think very rightly shoved him onto the outside. He moaned, but nothing wrong there. But there was the moving under braking, and there was questions about George moving under braking. He does move across when he takes the corner, but it is coming into a corner. And Leclerc does also have room to his left. There's room to George's right. He's been taking car, but Leclerc does have room to his left. Racing incident. It is a tough one. I think he does come across too early. So I think if there had been a penalty to George, it's one of those on the fence. I think a low penalty to George or a racing incident. But yeah, it was a very, very interesting end to the race. And the revision to how energy deployment works, I think, overall has worked. After the sprint, it did look a bit worrying, didn't it, that it was going to be a little dull. But no, I thought it was a very exciting race overall, and I think we did get to see some genuine racing. The one thing I will say, actually, I've not called this out earlier, but talking about Lewis, he got done on the inside by Max, and there was the give the place back moment, of course, in the sprint. So he gets done by Max. They both go off in the sprint just to give the place back to Lewis. They end up losing 4 seconds to the cars in front of them because they're trying to piss about with the energy deployment line. But Lewis did leave the door open again on the inside, and he did it again in the race. And maybe in the race, it was a done deal because of the damage. But with Max, knowing how he does the dive bomb and sometimes makes the corner and sometimes doesn't, and he'll do that because of the rules about getting alongside the front axle, which we've been through in a podcast before, which is very interesting. But Lewis does keep getting done on the inside. And other drivers, often they're trying to push him around the outside. make him go the long way around. Yes, it might compromise your line into corner, but if that's where the pass is going to happen, that's where it's going to happen. I think Charles much better at defending from Max, and I'm not sure. You look back to the big Max Lewis instance over the years, they do come together a lot, don't they? But I think this race, I thought Lewis was maybe a bit naive on some of his occasions. But again, maybe the race was done and it was more about just trying to maximise the time to the end of the race, really, than worrying about a charging Verstappen coming through on, at the time, a fresher set of tyres. And we move to Canada now. We have momentum with Antonelli. I think we are only 4 races into a 23 race season, I think now. And if it was a marathon, you would not be super worried about the seconds gap to those in front of you. This is the analogy that George used. I think it's a good one. It's 20 points. Yeah, 20 points is a lot, but there's a lot of races to go. And George Russell is a fighter. He's very quick. The first race of the season, didn't you? So it was pretty dominant. I think those two could be going at it all the way. The one thing I think has thrown a bit of a spanner is world champion Lando Norris is also coming to the party now. If McLaren upgrades that they've just had still keep them close to Mercedes, even with the upgrades, they're going to have something to say this season. But you would say at the moment, there's really, you could expect this season, Piastri to win a race, Norris, Antonelli, of course, George, Max, Charles, and Lewis. You would feel like all of them have a race win across the season in them. So that's a very exciting season. And looking forward to future seasons as a final thing to sign off on, V8s are coming back. And they're either coming back 2030 because the manufacturers accept it, or the FAA can now overrule the manufacturers and you'll get it in 2031. So that's pretty exciting. We're going to get the sound. I'm not sure how that will develop. There's going to be so much more going into this, but they announced it this weekend. So V8 is coming back. And I think that is a lovely note to finish on. Of course, with a shout out to Zanardi, by the way, who was an amazingly inspirational driver, athlete. He was in Formula One, was in IndyCar. He had his crash that unfortunately lost the full use of his legs. And he then became a wheelchair long distance racer and was a champion in that. And if you need inspiration for somebody who's tenacious, who's got a really remarkable story, Alex Zanardi is that person. So another one lost from the F1 family. But I think the only thing should be said about him is positives. What an incredible guy. And if you want something to go and look at on YouTube, go and look at The Pass. Toto Wolff talked about it in the after show, actually. Go and look at his pass in IndyCar. He does cut the next corner, but it was within the rules. But it is an amazing pass. It's a really incredible overtake. In modern F1, you wouldn't be able to do that overtake. You'd definitely be giving the place back. But it is immense. The dive down, where it is, the final lap. It's incredible. So go and watch that on YouTube. And Marshalls, I'll catch you next time out in Canada.